Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our pre-concert talk. My name is Kelly Corcoran. I'm the Associate Conductor of the Nashville Symphony. It's a great pleasure to see all of you here tonight and welcome you to our performance. Tonight we have a guest conductor on the podium. His name is Gilbert Varga. And then we are also having a wonderful pianist, John Kimura Parker, who's going to be playing the Rachmaninoff Rhapsody on a theme of Paganini. So first I'll tell you a little bit about the guest conductor and our guest artist, and then we'll dive into the repertoire. We're playing, of course, the Kodai Dances of Galanta, the Rachmaninoff, as I just mentioned, and then the Franck Symphony in D minor. So we have quite a program ahead of us tonight. The conductor, Gilbert Varga, he's kind of a sought-after guest conductor in Europe. He does quite a bit of guest conducting in Europe, and just in the past maybe 10 years or so has really made a splash here in the States. He appears regularly with major orchestras all around the country. He really has established a great relationship with even the Minnesota Orchestra, Philadelphia Orchestra. He's conducting this season as well. So he's really appeared with the top orchestras around the world. And it's a great pleasure to have him here in Nashville. This is his first time appearing in Nashville. And he is the son of a famous Hungarian violinist, Tibor Varga. So he has string roots in his blood. He was a violinist himself, and Hungarian roots in his blood as well, which helps us with the Kodai Dances of Galanta that you're going to see him conduct tonight. He's kind of known for his stick technique, for his use of the baton and his clarity of his baton technique. And I think you'll see that with him on the podium tonight. He often has, been asked, where did you develop this stick technique, this wonderful clarity and precision of your baton technique? And he said, well, I think that it's the job of a conductor to help, to help the musicians. You're there to help. And so that's your first and foremost job. And so, of course, along those lines comes this idea of clarity in your gesture and what it is that you're trying to communicate to the orchestra. And so it's, in his opinion, the job of the conductor to really help explain the piece and to explain, kind of digging into the piece and unfold it and unlock the mysteries, perhaps, of each piece of music. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we talk about each of the pieces tonight. Also, when asked what are the differences for him, he's had extensive experience working with with European orchestras, and only recently has come to the States. And so he's been asked, what are the differences between European orchestras and American orchestras? And his answer is that, in a way, American orchestras don't carry the luggage, the heavy luggage of tradition that many of these European orchestras carry. And he said sometimes when you go to places in Germany or Austria that, they might say, this bowing was from Brahms, we can't change it, and so there's this feeling that you can't change some of the elements of tradition. And he finds that very liberating here when he comes to America. Of course, there's wonderful traditions here, but that there tends to be maybe a more open-minded approach to some of these more traditional pieces of repertoire, and that is refreshing to him. And also a kind of general curiosity amongst American orchestras to really dig into this repertoire and to get to know it in a very kind of new way. He grew up in Switzerland. He was born in London, and even though his father was a Hungarian violinist, he did not come to Hungary and kind of come to his own roots until later on in the 1980s or so. So he feels that his Hungarian roots are very much a part of him, but he came to that later on in his life. So it's really been a great joy for me to be able to see him work this week with the orchestra and see a new face on the podium. And it's always intriguing to see a new conductor and how they work on a piece of music. For example, in the Dances of Galanta, in the first rehearsal, he started at the end of the piece, and he worked his way backwards. And it was kind of a refreshing approach. Very often conductors start at the beginning, and by starting at the end and kind of piecing your way, towards the beginning, you always knew where you were going and where you were arriving at. And it was an interesting way for the piece to unfold through the rehearsal process. So that was kind of exciting for me to see. Let's talk a little bit about John Kimura Parker, our pianist tonight. He's a Canadian pianist. He was born in Vancouver, and he has performed this Rachmaninoff Rhapsody on a theme of Paganini many times with orchestras all around the country and world. And I encourage all of you, if you have not already done so, to go on our website, and there's a wonderful little clip from YouTube of him talking about this concerto. You're nodding your head, so I think maybe you saw it. Many of you have seen it, but if you haven't, you should go on there, because he talks about the different variations and how the piece unfolds, and he knows this piece so well. So it's really, really exciting to see him here in Nashville to be presenting this fantastic piece of repertoire. So let's talk first about the Kodai, Dances of Galanta, which is first on our program. The Kodai, of course, was a Hungarian composer, and he was known kind of for three different things. First off, as an ethnomusicologist. He did a tremendous amount of work with folk music and finding the folk music of Hungary and preserving that tradition and integrating that tradition into the music that he composed. So ethnomusicology was a very, very important thing to him. Of course, he was also known as a composer for pieces such as Dances of Galanta that you'll hear tonight. And he also made a huge impact on music education. Many of you may be familiar with the Kodai method of education, and so that was another thing that he really championed and pioneered. So he kind of had these three aspects of his life. He was the son of someone who had worked, his father worked for the railroad station for the Austrian-Hungarian Railroad. And so he moved very often to different towns as a child and went to different parts of, really got to know Hungary and know this kind of Galanta, for example, is now part of Slovakia, but this part of Europe at this time. So I'd like to read for you a note that is in the preface of the score of the Dances of Galanta. That is an important note to think about in reference to this particular piece. Just give me 1 second here. I'm using this lovely chair as my music stand today. Okay. Galanta is a small Hungarian market town known to the travelers from Vienna to Budapest. The composer had passed there 7 years of his childhood. There existed at that time a famous gypsy band which has disappeared in the meantime. Their music was the first orchestral sonority which came to the ear of the child, of Kodai as a child. The forebears of these gypsies were known already more than 100 years ago. About 1800, some books of Hungarian dances were published in Vienna, and one of which contained music after several gypsies from Galanta. They have preserved the old Hungarian tradition, and in order to continue it, the composer has taken his principal subjects from these ancient editions. So Kodai spent several years of his childhood in Galanta hearing this gypsy music, and as he says here, this was the first orchestral sonority that came to his ears as a young child. Now, this gypsy music that he heard was in the style of kind of Verbunken style, it's called. And this basically was as the Austrian, I guess the military people would be coming through, marching through, trying to recruit soldiers to join their forces. They would have gypsies that would go along with them, and they would be playing music and having all kinds of festivities going on, and the idea was to try to get young men to try to sign on to be part of the military. Now, of course, all of these young men knew that being part of the military involved more than just gypsy, beautiful music and song and dance and wine and all of these things, but they knew that this kind of festivities, this kind of enjoyment, so to speak, was part of the lifestyle of being in the military. Along with the war and the conflict and the fear came merriment and camaraderie and music and drinking and all of these fun things as well, so to speak. So the gypsy music was a way to kind of recruit people to join in the forces. And so this is where this tradition came from. Of course, then there came a time when it became mandatory to have service in the military, and then you didn't need to have these people marching around trying to get you to join their forces anymore. And it was at this time that the gypsy tradition and this music kind of started to fade into the distance, because it wasn't needed anymore for this military recruitment. So that's kind of how this music started to fade away a little bit. But Kodai really wanted to preserve this music. And so when he was asked to compose a piece for the 80th anniversary of the Budapest Philharmonic, of course he thought to himself, I'm going to use these gypsy dances, and I'm going to use them in this new work, the dances of Galanta. Now, you can hear this gypsy dancing. You can imagine all the members of the orchestra with, getting their gypsy spirit and soul to come out of them as they're playing. And in particular, there's a fantastic clarinet solo that really is prominent at the beginning of the piece. And I was talking to James Zimmerman, our principal clarinetist, because he sounds fantastic. And I said, James, you're finding the gypsy inside of you. But he really is. It's just really fun, I think, to hear what is authentic folk music, authentic folk music taken from Kodai, who's worked so hard to preserve this tradition and to preserve these melodies and this character and this feeling, and then him as a great masterful composer to put it into a colorful, exuberant piece that just takes off. So I think this is one of those pieces where, as you listen to it, you have to put yourself into in your mind, in your imagination, see these gypsies kind of playing this really virtuoso music, music full of virtuosity, and very, very enlivened and active and energized. So it's a great, exciting piece. I'll just tell you a few more things about Kodai that I found to be very interesting. Of course, Kodai was doing a lot of his ethnomusicology, his work in folk music. He worked very closely with Bartók, of course, who also cared very deeply about folk music from Hungary. And they were very, very good friends. And even in their young, when they were in their 20s, they would go and they would find all of these tunes and they would try to preserve them and chronicle them. And it's very interesting that Kodai and Bartók took very different routes, or paths, so to speak, in their music. Bartók's music sounds very different from Kodai's music, yet they both cared so deeply about this folk tradition, which I find very interesting. And just to say a word or two about the Kodai method of music education, which I also found very interesting as well. Are any of you familiar with the Kodai method? Some of you are. Very good. My sister actually she's a teacher, and she went to Hungary to study more about the Kodai method, and she uses it. She's a choral conductor, and so she uses it in her teaching with high school students very often. Well, and with younger students is where it really comes into play more so. But the Kodai method, it's very logical. It integrates things of the idea of using movement as a way of teaching, using hand signals as a way of showing, a tonal gesture. As you move up a scale, hand gestures maybe show that movement. I don't know all the gestures exactly, so I'm not going to try to show them. But he worked with music educators to evolve this system that was used very widely in Hungary and really made a huge impact on music education. And I think it's profound that education was such a valuable part of him and his identity and his lasting impact on the musical world. Let's talk now a little bit about the Rachmaninoff, because this is just one of those pieces that is a masterpiece, audience favorite. Everybody loves this piece. How many of you have heard this piece before? Of course. Many of you have. Yes, of course. So the Rachmaninoff Rhapsody on a theme of Paganini is probably incorrectly titled Rhapsody, because it's not really a rhapsody. It's really a set of variations. And these variations, of course, are on the theme of Paganini, the last of his 24 caprices for violin. I find it interesting that there are 24 of these violin caprices, and that there are 24 variations in the Rachmaninoff Rhapsody on a theme. And in all the things that I read about this piece, no one made that connection or correlation, maybe because it's obvious, but still, I found it to be interesting. I wonder if that's why he chose 24 variations for the piece. Of course, the theme, many of you will know it and recognize it. Paganini's theme is the yum ba-da-da-da-da-dum, ba-da-da-da-da-dum, ba-da-da-da-da-da-dum, ba. Yes, okay. So what Rachmaninoff does, this piece was composed after he had left Russia, and he was he never really returned to Russia. And this was a time in his life where composing was juggled with conducting and with appearing as a pianist. He, like Kodai, had three aspects of his identity: composer, conductor, pianist. Three different things than Kodai, but three parts of him that were really, working together here. And at this time in his life, this is 1834, I believe, when he composed this piece. Excuse me, not 1834. 1934, I said the wrong date, excuse me. Very big difference, 1934. 1934 when he composed this, and the reason I was confused for a second is the Kodai was 1933 and the Rachmaninoff is 1934. They're 1 year apart, which I find very, very interesting, that both of these pieces come from the same exact time period. So 1934 is our time period here. This piece was premiered by the Philadelphia Orchestra with Stokowski conducting with Rachmaninoff at the piano in Baltimore. That was where the premiere performance was given. So he, unfortunately at this time, was not able to spend as much time composing because he was having to make a living playing piano and traveling all over the place as a pianist, as this virtuoso pianist all over the world in a sense that he was performing. Now, the piece unfolds. First you hear a little introduction, and then you hear the first variation, and then you hear the theme. So this is kind of unusual because Rachmaninoff doesn't start off by giving you the theme, boom. Instead, you dive in the middle of this whole thing. The variation just kind of takes off, this brief introduction, variation number 1, and then our theme. And then we go on to this roller coaster, so to speak, where these variations just come right on top of each other. And as John Kimura Parker says very well in his YouTube clip, he says, you know, you're not expected to know where each variation begins and ends because they flow very, very quickly into each other and kind of take off. But in the midst of this set of 24 variations, there is a bigger structure as well. There's almost as if there's 3 movements going on, a very typical concerto form. Our opening variations are very fast-paced in the typical sense that the first movement of a concerto would be fast and allegro and vibrant. And then our middle part of the Rhapsody is very, very slow and very, very legato and very lyrical. In the same way that the middle movement of a concerto would be kind of in a slow lyrical vein. And then we take off again at the end with some faster variations, just like the third movement of a typical concerto would. And so now another thing that's interesting about this piece is that we have our Paganini theme, but Rachmaninoff thought, okay, I need a little bit more than just my Paganini theme to create all these variations. And so he included in there as well the Dies Irae theme, this ba-da-dee-da-da-da-dum, which we hear often in lots of other pieces as well. And so this is kind of like death, you know, harking on the corner, so to speak, you know. And Rachmaninoff was very obsessed with this theme. He was very, very interested in this theme and used it quite a bit in his life. Some people say that Paganini sold his soul to the devil to create, you know, be this virtuoso player. And so some people feel that Rachmaninoff integrated the Dies Irae theme into the Paganini variations to kind of show that aspect of Paganini, that perhaps he was maybe in a deal with some dark, dark forces, so to speak. But Paganini was like Rachmaninoff. He was a virtuoso on his instrument, also a composer as well, just like Rachmaninoff was. So this is kind of an interesting thing in this relationship. Of course, we come to the very famous variation that you all know and love, the dee-da-dee-da-da, dee-da-da-da, da-ya-da-dee-da-da. It's so gorgeous. That's in the middle of this piece. And this is brilliant. And again, I keep calling out this YouTube video that John made because it's so wonderful the way he shows this. When you hear yum ba da 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 dum ba da 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 dum ba da da da, you might think, how does he get da da dee da da dee da da da? Well, he takes the 16th notes of that gesture, and then what he does is he puts them in a different key. He then makes them major, and he turns them upside down, and then you get, and then of course he slows it down, and we have da da dee da da. So it's exactly related to the theme. It's incredible, incredible this relationship, and it just shows all the imagination that Rachmaninoff found in this piece. And I don't know about any of you out there, but every time I listen to this piece, when that variation comes, it's like, ah. Oh, it's a rival moment, you know, and I always can almost feel tingling, you know, I get goosebumps when that variation comes. And when it ends, I always want it to be longer, you know. I wish that it just kept going, but I think that's the brilliance of this piece, you know. He gives you this beautiful, magical moment, and then it just takes off, you know, just like all these other variations. They're so quick in the way that they unfold. It's really, really, really brilliant in the way that all of this comes together. All right, let's see. What else to say about Rachmaninoff? The end of the piece, of course, we have this wonderful little coda at the end that is basically only 2 little bars of a coda, a little tag at the end of the piece, which is kind of a tip of the hat, so to speak. It's really, really kind of cute and funny, so you'll hear that as well when you get to the end of the Rachmaninoff. Let's talk now about Franck. The Franck Symphony in D minor, which in many ways is really the bulk of our program tonight. This is the meat of our program tonight. This is the big piece of repertoire that we come to after intermission. Now, Franck was someone who had a little bit of an identity crisis because he was born in Belgium. But then he went on to teach at the Paris Conservatory. He moved to Paris when he was only 12 years old and spent most of his life in France. But he never was kind of accepted, so to speak, by his colleagues and his peers because he was born in Belgium. And some of those French, folks that he was working with, just kind of, in a way, they just, even though he even became a French citizen as well, because he wouldn't be allowed to teach at the conservatory unless he had this French citizenship. So he became a citizen as well before he was teaching at the Paris Conservatory. But this was something just that I think was kind of an undercurrent in his life, this little bit of a feeling of maybe being somewhat of an outsider in some of the social circles of Paris. He just never quite made his way fitting into some of these social circles. And the Symphony No. D that we come to, he composes a little bit later in his life when he's 63 years old. So in the premiere performance comes 1 year before his death. And I don't know about you guys out there, but I always feel that when you're listening to a piece of music, you can sometimes hear that maturation, that maturity in a composer, I think, in their repertoire. And this is one of those pieces that I think you can tell when you're listening to it that it's composed by someone that has lived a long life, a long musical life, that has really studied their craft, really understands music in a deep way. But what's interesting is that this is really his first attempt to write a big, broad symphony. He'd never really attempted to write symphonic form until this point in his life. And this comes at a time in France when, opera reigned. It was all about opera, and people didn't really write symphonies. French composers didn't really write symphonies. Of course, German composers did. But French composers really didn't write what they called a symphony at this time. So even in that regard, he was somewhat criticized for writing a symphony at a time that really this was not what people did. Also, he was a member of the National Society of Music in France, and Saint-Saëns was the director of this society. And there came a time around this period where they decided that they were going to accept, or support, I suppose is a better word, support the music of other countries and of other composers. And they were going to support the German tradition. And this was not okay to many of the people who started this French society of nationalistic music. So there was a kind of rift that came between the people who thought, no, it's okay, we should support what some of these German composers are doing, and those that thought, no, we need to be pure, and retain the French tradition and not allow this mingling. So there was this conflict going on there as well. Franck was on the side of wanting to integrate the Germanic tradition into his writing, and so this also left him with some enemies and some people who didn't agree with him. And in particular, Liszt was a very, very big influence on France, and on Franck, excuse me. I'm having stumbles tonight, I apologize. Liszt was a big impact on Franck in his composing. And you'll hear that in this piece because it's kind of a cyclic type of piece in the sense that there's one theme that comes back again and again and again in this piece. And that was something that came from Liszt, this idea of having one kind of theme that evolves and keeps coming back, a cyclic type of gesture. So Franck took that Liszt tradition and that Liszt idea and integrated it into this symphony in D. So okay, so here he is, he's 63 years old. He has this feeling of somewhat being an outsider. He has some people who don't agree with his integration of Germanic ideas into his music making. And so he decides, I'm going to, write this symphony. And of course, he wants a premiere. Nobody wants to play the piece. Nobody wants to play the piece. And so he kind of pulls his weight a little bit on the faculty of the Paris Conservatory, because you have to, support your colleagues on the faculty of the conservatory. So he was able to get a performance through the Paris Conservatory, but even that had a had a lot of pushback. People didn't want to give this performance. So he really had to try hard to get this piece to be performed. Of course, now it has become kind of a staple of the repertoire. This piece is performed very, very often. It's beloved by audiences. I'm just checking how much time we have here. There's a funny story that the conductor told me about this piece. He said he heard this story that, and he said he wasn't sure what orchestra it was. He said it might have been the Philadelphia Orchestra, but there was a violist who was taking an audition. And he won a prominent job. Let's say it's the Philadelphia Orchestra, but I'm not sure. It could be a different orchestra. And he wins this prominent position. Let's say it's associate principal viola. And he's negotiating his contract. And he says to them, but I do not want to play the Franck Symphony in D. and he wouldn't sign his contract until someone put that into his contract. And so, this is the stigma that some people have for this piece. There are some players that really do not like this piece of music. It's unusual, but it's a funny story, because it's kind of crazy to think as a player that you would say that you're not going to, put a piece of repertoire into your job. But what I think is stunning about this piece is that despite it being called a symphony, it is for the time, extremely avant-garde, using this idea of one theme and having it come back again and again and again and again. And it's a glorious, glorious musical material that is all generated from these primary themes. It's in 3 movements, which is also kind of unusual for a symphony at this time. The middle movement takes on the role of being both kind of a slow movement as well as a scherzo kind of movement. I should also say that Franck was extremely famous and renowned as an organ player. Really, that was what he was mostly known for, is his virtuosity on the organ. He was a fantastic organist. And you can hear the organ sonorities in this piece. You feel like you are listening to an organ. And again, some people criticized this. But why? What's wrong with making the orchestra sound like an organ? It's not easy to make an orchestra sound like an organ. It takes talent and skill and beauty, and it's an amazing experience to be listening to an orchestra and to hear these sonorities come through. So I think it is a brilliant piece. And I think that some of the things the conductor has done to really make it come to life, there's extreme dynamic contrast in this piece. Moments of pianissimos that are just the most delicate, beautiful moments, and then moments of glorious fortissimos. And the conductor has really, really worked hard to achieve that contrast, which helps the piece to really come to life. Also, in the first movement, if any of you are very familiar with this piece, the tempo might seem a little slower than you might be used to hearing. And I think it's quite beautiful, the tempo that he's taking. It really allows it to extend and unfold, and just it has a very organic feeling to it. So it's a wonderful piece of music. And I think all 3 of these pieces really, really represent the composer. And the great skills of each of these composers. Kodály, with his love of folk music and his wonderful ability to integrate that into the orchestra. Rachmaninoff, with his fantastic technique on the piano and his colorful ear for orchestration. And then Franck, with his beautiful organ sonorities that he's able to grasp in the orchestra in a piece of music that was very significant at the time. Franck was loved by his students. Compared to Beethoven. He made a huge impact on the future of French music, and we cannot forget him. So this is a really fun night of music making, and I want to thank you all for being here tonight, and I hope that you enjoy the performance. So thank you so much.